It's Paul Nason here with the Canadian Mental Health Association. I want to welcome everybody to the webinar tonight. It's called From Dependency to Recovery during COVID-19. Well, maybe as you know, the Dependency to Recovery program was a program that was run in St. John last fall. And it was scheduled to run in St. John in the spring, but we couldn't because of the pandemic that hit. So this presentation takes information from that, but in general, it's more to do with what's happening right now in our circumstances in our community. So again, my name is Paul Nason. I'm a social worker, and I've been working in the field of addictions for about 16 years, and then prior to that in various jobs in social services. Right now, I work as a clinical social worker on the base in Gagetown. And there I do a lot of work in addiction, in particular with folks who have PTSD and various other forms of trauma or mental health issues. And I also do a private practice as well, where I work with folks with a whole variety of mental health issues, but primarily addiction. In the past, I've worked in methadone and in rehab and as an outpatient counselor. And as we go forward, there will be a chance to type questions in. So my presentations are usually pretty informal. So I'm just gonna talk about some things to do with addiction and recovery, and work in some things about the pandemic. And if you have any questions, as you can see, just put them in the Q&A. Because I won't be able to see anything you type in the chat at all during the presentation. I'll only be able to see your questions at the very end, which is when I would take a chance to look at those. And as well, if you please, there's a survey at the end. So I just need to end the presentation, and then you can do the survey if you'd like. But you can't do the survey if you leave first and come back. I have to be the one that ends the presentation. And along the way, if you have any questions at all, please call the CMHA, and the number's there, about this presentation, about me, or about any of the information that we talk about today at all. For clarification, just don't hesitate to call. So before we get started, I'm going to acknowledge that the circumstances are quite unique right now with the pandemic that we're in. It's been very challenging for all of us. It's not a normal situation. They're saying it's a new normal, but I would hope it isn't. And I myself am off work. I was working 1 day a week, and then I was working 2 days a week. And I've been home, and I've been experiencing the slow de-evolution of my life. Anything from my eating habits to my sleep habits to my level of exercise to my conversations I'm having. I'm spending more time on my phone. Like, there's a lot of things that are creeping now into my life that I guess can relate to this type of situation. So I just want to put it out there in case there's anyone out there who is right now in crisis. Some of the options that we have, and they're on the screen there. The two numbers at the bottom are both St. John numbers. So if you call those and you live in a different region of New Brunswick, you can ask about the services in your location from those, I would hope. But please, if there's anything happening currently, if you're in crisis, if you have suicidal thinking, do not hesitate to call. That is not something that you're expected to live with. That is not any part of this that was ever meant to be normal. And there's help available. So I just wanted to say that first to get that support out there. So to get started, I guess this presentation is I'm gonna try to just have some fun with it. It's not going to be anything that's technical or complicated. This is just me talking about recovery. Hopefully, we can have a conversation at the end with some questions and answers. But this is just going to be a very down-to-earth presentation. And to get that started, I'd just like to say that this presentation isn't going to be about saying a lot of things about what people should or shouldn't be doing right now. The main thing to do right now is for us all is just to survive, and that's the best way we know how. So there's no magic formula. You know, there's nothing expected of anybody right now. There's certainly no expectation about being perfect, about doing things a certain way. My take on it is we do the best we can with what we've got right now, and that's good enough. So I mean, as that relates back to recovery when in normal conditions, that could be said to be a philosophy of it is, you know, let's do the best we can to keep things going the way that they are, and hopefully things get better. But at the very least, staying the course is a good thing. So that's it. That's basically what it is. And everybody out there today, or anybody who sees this presentation, is going to have different access to resources, different support networks, capability for different things. So I'm not going to talk about things that people should or shouldn't be doing because I have no idea what people have available to them. There's a lot of different levels in society, as you know, of privilege. So this is more about you. This is more about feeling better in the moment, trying to reduce some anxiety. So I guess right off the hop, just wanted to say that, I mean, one of the things I thought of right away when this started was we need to have help, more accessible resources for addiction, because it seems to me that the conditions of this pandemic almost mimic the conditions that people could be living in when they're sick with addiction or when they're not very well, before they ask for help. So the first thing that came to mind was being socially isolated. I mean, a lot of times folks, before they get help, are isolated. As you know, perhaps addiction is an illness that puts a person on an island. It disconnects a person completely from society, and can disconnect them from society through no fault of their own. And so one of the triggers right now for a person could be just that. It could be being isolated, you know, spending a lot of time at home, not seeing anybody, not having face-to-face conversations with people. You know, a big part of recovery for a lot of folks is having face-to-face conversations. So just that alone could be a trigger. Along those lines, keeping thoughts and feelings to ourselves, not having that outlet all the time to talk about those. Another trigger could be sort of because addiction is sort of like operates in the subconscious. A lot of us are very anxious right now, you know, and we're afraid. You know, it's despite what the news is saying about lines and flattening curves and things, it's a scary time, and recovery is hard enough. It's a hard enough job to do without any extra fear going on. So, and triggers are something in recovery that we're not always aware of. So, and that's what makes addiction so mysterious is, you know, it can keep coming back because it does operate somewhat in the subconscious. So I'd just like to get that out there that if you're into recovery and you're into tracking or looking at your triggers, if you're helping clients with triggers, things like that, what I've been doing in my practice or what I've been trying to do is identify them. Just identify them, call them what they are, and let's make triggers just triggers. Because as you know, what can happen is I'll just keep going right down the list, is if we leave them and they get in our heads, they get in our hearts and in our minds and in our bodies, some physical things can start happening. You know, with anxiety, there's things that can happen like insomnia and reduced appetite and shortness of breath and all kinds of phantom pains. You can have all sorts of different things, you know, start to happen, even bordering on panic. So post-acute withdrawal can come back. And so PAW for short, post-acute withdrawal is a normal part of recovery. And for those of you who have gone through it, you know, it starts in 2 to 3 weeks, perhaps a week or 2 to 3 weeks after you've stopped using, once you're through acute withdrawal. So post-acute withdrawal is a set of returning symptoms such as lack of concentration, irritability, concentration problems, anxiety, panic. So there's you know, there's a lot of things that can happen that are quite they're frustrating because in recovery, we wonder what's going on. Why is this happening to me? I thought I was, I thought I was doing okay, and now all of a sudden I'm struggling. So just be on the lookout. And if you're not familiar with post-acute withdrawal, you can search it online and take a look at that. It's very, it's helpful to be educated on that, where it is part of recovery. It's not going to be something that we can go around in our recoveries. We will experience it. So next on down the line, these are just some things that could be happening right now during the pandemic. The return of some addictive thinking and then cravings. So one of the things that is quite a challenge for folks in recovery is being in recovery when no one's looking. And so that's kind of like an accountability piece of that. So because the pandemic has forced us into isolation, we're spending a lot more time alone. We're spending a lot more time perhaps bored. We may not have outlets for activities that we had before that keep us going. Like I've heard a lot of people say they're really missing the gym, they're really missing their friends, they're really missing restaurants, they're missing out on those things. So when a person gets isolated and gets alone too much, what can happen is addictive thinking can start. And so that may be mostly what the illness is composed of. It's not so much, and I'll talk about relapse next, but as you know, it's not a situation where we go straight back to using. It's a process where we start having some thoughts first. So the pileup of isolation, the pileup of anxiety, maybe some depression kicks in. Maybe we're getting upset now and angry at the situation. Maybe we're starting to get resentful. We're fed up, with it, and it sucks. It's frustrating, and an addiction is something that, even though we're in recovery, an addiction is something that's waiting for thinking like that to occur. Because what can happen is I get thinking like that, and I start operating on my emotions, and then that little thought slips in. I'll just have one. I'll just have one. No one's gonna see. It'll be something I can do right now to feel better. And that sort of thinking is almost viral in itself, in that if it's not short-circuited, and if it's not something that I can talk about with somebody else and get that out, then that can start to get traction in my mind, and other wheels start spinning. So as you know, so I mean, thoughts build upon thoughts, addictive thoughts. And I start going down that road. And so again, leave that thinking to as it is, and that starts to become physical. I always say what starts in the head drops into the body. Depending on what your substance of choice was or your behavior of choice, you could start having cravings, and you could start having things like butterflies in your stomach. You could start having, depending on if it's alcohol or opiates, you could start yawning. You could start, having goose flesh. If it's something like cocaine, your mind could start racing. If it's something like marijuana or cannabis, it's stress, it's insomnia, it's so just, and I'm not like saying that anyone's doing those things, and just saying that if it is, to be watchful of that. We call that pseudo symptoms. It's almost like you're in withdrawal from the substance, but you haven't used it. All you've been doing is thinking about it. That's powerful enough to get the body reacting. So that's why talking about recovery is so important, and we can't do that as much right now as we used to do, because through a recovery program, we're always talking about recovery, and there's always a risk of addictive thinking and cravings to come back. So without that outlet, there's a higher probability that we're going to go down that road. So, and I'll talk more about some recovery strategies. Symptoms of relapse. So relapse is a word that people use differently. People will say, I relapsed, meaning they used, or some people will say, I'm in relapse. It doesn't matter what you call it. It's a process. It's how you understand the process. But once we can get ahead of addiction a little bit, we can start to understand that it's not a spontaneous thing. It's usually a process that we set up. always say that slips are a manufactured event. So it's once we say that, we kind of know that we can be in charge of our recoveries, and start to be more in tune with symptoms of relapse. However, that being said, the pandemic is mimicking symptoms of relapse again as well, because we're not on a clock. We're a lot of us are home. A lot of us are just sort of going about our day, not really in routines, nothing consistent. When I worked in rehab, I would always say, what's the world of addiction look like versus the world of recovery? And the world of recovery is sort of on a schedule. Things that we do that are planned out and on purpose, and intentional to keep ourselves well. Whereas in addiction, it's not planned out, it's not scheduled, it's a random series of events. It's emotionally kind of a roller coaster, and it's pretty isolated. So, and that's no one's fault right now. It's just to be aware of. It's just to be, I guess, the conversation is just to increase awareness that we're in the conditions of relapse right now, whether we like it or not. And to be mindful of that, and if you have support networks, to be talking to them about that. Slips. So if you're in recovery, a slip is just a slip. It's probably how you learned about how to get into recovery. It's probably your greatest teacher. So if slips are happening right now, and it's something that's starting to get away on you, there's numbers there that you can call. But remember, you can always start your day over again. Anyone can start their day at any time. So you can start your recovery anytime. So even though it might be disappointing, you might be frustrated that there's lost time. If you're keeping track of your recovery, jump right back on. You don't lose your recovery skills. You don't. They stay with you, and it's no harm done. And so. A wise person in rehab once said, "I haven't seen a man or woman get sober beating themselves up." So it's try to learn what you can and move forward, and certainly know that you can ask for help. Yeah. So next is just to be aware that, and I guess why I put this down here was, a lot of people, I guess not the reason, but a lot of people do take medications. And with this pandemic, what I've found is that the time people take their medications is becoming inconsistent. A lot of folks are almost having days and nights reversed, where it's stay up, and then sleep till noon. And then if it's a medication you would have normally taken in the morning, you're not taking it until after lunch, or maybe even late afternoon. And then the next morning, maybe do take it at the right time. So that's going to create some inconsistencies in our mind and bodies, and it's going to have more of an impact than we know. It'd be underestimated. And so if there's any kind of addictive thinking happening, and there's an underlying anxiety issue, and there's inconsistent taking of medications, and maybe nutrition's a little out of whack, and we're not hydrated properly, you could go down a dangerous road there. So you're not alone. Just remember that you're not alone on that, and you're doing the best that you can. And however we get back on track is our business, in recovery. So, but just to let you know that if there's anything like that happening, you're not alone, and there is a way to get back on. And that's probably by reaching out, and having a conversation about recovery. So the beginnings of the addictive cycle are, it's risky right now for that to happen, because the cycle is composed of using, being in withdrawal, starting to feel better, life happens, life's not always good. How do I feel better quick? I go back to my substance, and then around and around I go. So because life is not very good right now, it's risky that the cycle could start, just because of all the things that have changed. The other piece is about that is that addiction is a very black and white existence. It doesn't have much gray area. It's life becomes, when we're when we are actively engaged in our addictions, life is time between using. So with that, there's not very much flexibility and adaptability. And this pandemic is calling on us to be very flexible and very adaptable. And that could end up being quite a challenge for us. And addiction, again, is, if it's an addiction you have, then that's waiting in the wings to come back, and really enjoys an addiction really does enjoy a very black and white lifestyle. It doesn't want you thinking gray. It wants to consume. So with that is to watch for that is there's things like that can happen, like taking over-the-counter medications, taking Gravol, taking cough medicines, taking things, eating a lot of sugar, having a lot of caffeine. Like, there's things that an addiction will try to get you doing before it gets you back to your substance ahead of time. In that it starts getting people to operate on immediate gratification. So I have a need, I take a pill, or I have a need, I do something. I don't wait to think about that. And I find that that's happening a lot. There's also, and I'm just talking about the cycle right now. One of the things that I find is conversations now is, what are you watching? What are you watching? What are you watching? And it's binge watching, and it's a lot of shows, and that's great. That's something that's a conversation piece, but that's dangerous for anybody who's working on recovery, because that ends up being on the couch too long. That ends up being, I'm not in a conversation anymore. What did it look like in addiction? And I'm speaking frankly because I've worked in this field a long time. Addiction looks like that. Addiction looks like sitting on the couch watching TV a lot of the time. So we want our lives to look as much as they can like recovery, and that would mean a controlled amount of TV, but then balancing that out with things that are good for our emotions and our social and our physical, things like that. So I guess that's just a little bit of some information about what I know anyway about recovery. So moving on, what I've done is kind of just to have some fun with this. I'm just comparing the two, COVID-19 with addiction. And so I'm just going to go through and I'll talk a little bit about each point, but it's what it's meant to do is give some information about addiction and recovery at the same time as just kind of have some fun with this whole situation that we're in, if we can, for a short amount of time tonight. So yeah, COVID-19 and addiction, they're both illnesses. They're not choices. So they have that in common. So I get that a lot. And I'm sure if you work in the addiction services field, or if you're in recovery, you know that there are people out there that believe that it's a choice, right? And it's not. It's not something that anybody ever chose to have. It is an illness, and a person can be sick with it. So that's why we have addiction services, but that's why it's also not something that a person should ever be blamed for. And I guess I'll apologize in advance as I go through this. I might repeat myself on some of these points. So I do apologize for that. But I have a lot to say about some of these things about I guess anti-oppressive addiction practice. Addiction and COVID-19, they don't discriminate who they affect. Addiction will affect anybody in our society, just the same as the flu will. So it doesn't matter about socioeconomic status. It doesn't matter about anything where you're from. It doesn't matter about age, gender. It's something that's there that can affect anybody. In the beginning, it was interesting how they announced that Tom Hanks and some celebrities and the Prime Minister's wife had COVID-19 so openly, whereas if somebody had and I'm not slandering either of those people in any way, but what I'm saying is that people aren't so quick to speak up if they have addiction, but they are when they have COVID-19, and they're both illnesses. So that there's something to be said there, and I will actually say a bit more about that later on. Neither define our worth. The analogy I use for this is if you had a $50 bill and you crumpled it all up and you threw it in the ground and you threw it outside and you drove over it a bunch of times, it's still worth $50. So it has its value. So I guess what I want to say is about that is if a person has an addiction, they have value. If a person has COVID-19, they have value. Neither define our worth. The problem with it in society now is that a lot of times, and I'm going to talk about this more later on, is people with addiction, they do feel like they're less than because of society, because of power differentials in our society. So, but they're the same thing. They're both an illness, addiction and COVID-19. Next one is both have a disproportionate effect on vulnerable and marginalized populations. The thing that I noticed about this is, and I'm gonna speak anti-oppressively along the way. I'm gonna make some comparisons. Is older folks, senior citizens, are vulnerable to COVID-19, and so for that reason, special care homes and a lot of our older friends they're not able to be seen right now. And I'll talk about this more later, but what I've seen happen is I've seen busloads of senior citizens being taken to casinos, and so addiction is also an illness. So it's both ways. So it's on the one hand, they're vulnerable to this illness, but even though they're vulnerable to another illness, it's not recognized enough, or as much, that older folks, senior folks are vulnerable to addiction as well. Marginalized populations are more vulnerable to COVID-19, just as they are addiction, because they don't have the resources, and that's not their fault. It's system flaws and poverty and lack of resources and discrimination and stereotype and stigma that keep people driven down. And so because people with privilege in society have access to healthcare more than people in poverty, they are not going to be affected as much. So that's just, maybe call it my soapbox, but it's just I'm a social worker, and it's the way that I view it, and so that's one of the things that could be said to be similar. And throughout this, I guess I'm trying to emphasize some of the things about addiction that are realities. Both addiction and COVID-19 have kept us, keep us on lockdown. So. And isolate us both. So as I mentioned before, a lot of times in the beginning when we're very sick with addiction, we are alone. But then once we get well and into recovery, there is still the potential for that to happen again with relapse and with returning to addictive use. And even with mental health things like anxiety and depression, those are also things that happen. And even without addiction, without mental health issues, as people here in society, it's a tough situation, and for anyone, we're going to have to call on all of our coping skills to get through. COVID-19 and addiction have both divided us rather than connect us. So that's, I guess, back to the point of the conditions right now in society. For a lot of folks can look like addiction because we are divided. Addiction preys on disconnection, whereas recovery loves connection. So with connection being in large part the answer to recovery and sort of the one of the, call it an antidote to addiction, it's tough right now. We're doing the best we can, and we're doing the best we can to remain connected. Some more similarities, both addiction and COVID-19 come from the animal kingdom. When I was working in rehab and in beyond, one of the things that I was always asked was, is addiction hereditary? How does it come about? Is it learned? Is it in the blood? But I guess the main thing to say here is that addiction is in the human population regardless of substances. It's a chronic illness that can exist in us, and addiction is not substances. Addiction is in us. So it's the way we think, it's the way we feel, and there can be aspects of it that are hereditary. But I guess anyone working on recovery will know that once they got clean, or if you're not in recovery, something to expect is when you get clean, the addiction doesn't go away. It's something that takes a lot of work, a lot of effort to start to make some changes with thinking and how we manage our emotions. Both flourish socially. Yeah. So, I mean, as you know, we're all alone, and I'm sitting in a room here in my house because I'm supposed to, so I don't spread or catch COVID-19. So if I go out, it has a chance to flourish, and addiction is something that can do that too. And I guess what I mean by that is anybody who's ever started working on recovery or is familiar with that, or workers out there who are working with folks know that it's one of the things that is important but very difficult to do is to change up your social situation so that you're not triggered by folks who are using or involved in addiction, because that's generally where we end up when we're in addiction, is with other people who are also in addiction. So yeah, that's kind of one of the things that's similar maybe about it is that they're both socially, or yeah, spread or get worse, as it were. Both are family illnesses. So yeah, so with addiction, the analogy we use with addiction is a mobile hanging over a baby's crib. You know, they're all little stuffed animals hanging on strings. And so if you touch one, what happens to all of them is they all move. So that's the analogy in a family with addiction, is if one person has addiction, everyone is affected by it. And in treatment, that is something that is very important, is that and is offered, is if you call the 674-4300 phone number, there's a program there that they call Family Program that gives people information about the impact of addiction on the family, and that's a whole other webinar. But yeah, for now, to know that COVID-19 is you know, we are with our families, and now we're allowed a bubble family. So it's a very close knit type of a situation now with it. And both have no vaccine. I guess what I mean by that is that could end up being a difference, excuse me, is there may be a vaccine for COVID-19, but the virus itself will still exist. And so addiction, even though it can be something that we put into remission or call it arrest the problem and start working on recovery, there's no cure for addiction. So recovery is the answer to that, and it has a specific set of rules to it, which I'll talk about later on. We follow. So recovery or survival during COVID-19 would be similar to recovery in that there's no medicine that we're going to take that makes it go away. It's going to be a set of behaviors that we follow and do that very well. As New Brunswickers, you're all doing it extremely well, and from what I hear is we're leading the way in Canada right now. Yeah, both require disinfectant. So I put the disinfectant word up there. I don't know if you're watching any CNN right now or lately. There was a little funny thing that happened about disinfectant there, and so I got a kick out of that because right away I thought, okay, putting disinfectant into my addiction or somebody's addiction would be like injecting recovery into it. So when that politician said they should inject disinfectant, what I thought is the analogy in recovery would be call somebody. If I'm starting to have thoughts and feelings and anxiety and anger and resentment, what do I need to do? I need to get some disinfectant. So what that means is call somebody, get that cleaned up, get straightened out there. So with COVID-19, it's the same thing. Disinfectant can help to prevent that and stay well. Both mutate, meaning that the virus itself, the COVID-19 virus, has the ability to mutate, but so does addiction. And what I mean by that is, as you know, is we work on recovery for a little while. We get to a place where we feel that we've got this now, and we relax. And as you know, addiction has a way of showing up some other way. And that's why we have recovery programs that we participate in and put energy into every day. because knowing that that addiction is just as creative as we are, and will try to come at us in different ways. So addiction. So recovery is done on purpose to defend ourselves against all the various mutations of addiction that come at us every day. So there's that, and both can require medical attention. So yeah, and I'll talk a bit more about addiction that way. But yeah, COVID-19, it can put a person in the hospital, and so can addiction. And it's about that phase of so some more similarities. Both are misunderstood. So across the world, there's a lot of things happening right now with COVID-19 that they're trying to develop a vaccine. They're studying this virus. They're trying to understand this virus, and aren't there yet. And but will be. And I think that even though we do get there with it, we don't know how to cure viruses. So with that, it's same with addiction. Addiction is they call it cunning and baffling in the program. It's an insidious thing. It's a very mysterious thing, and we're not all on the same page with it. So where I come from at it is I come at it from an angle of empathy and understanding and compassion, and that people are not doing any of these things on purpose. It's an illness, versus there's a large part of society that thinks that addiction is a choice, and there's a lot of blame and anger and things like that. So again, I'll talk a little bit more about that later. Both are invisible until they're visible. So yeah. So the interesting thing about that is you can't see either of these things, right? You can't. I mean, they're there, but you can't see them. Addiction has been said to be, the one chronic illness that you have only if you believe you have it. Because if you've ever known anyone in your life who's had an addiction, but they don't think they have it, there's nothing you're saying to them that's going to convince them that they have it. They're probably going to tell you have it, and that's not any fault of theirs. That's no reflection on them as any kind of person. It's just the way that addiction works. When it's in the denial phase, it's when it's got hold of somebody, they're doing the best they can. And you can't see it. So you usually can't see addiction until things go wrong. When I worked at Ridgewood, people didn't show up at Ridgewood when things were going well. They showed up when things are going wrong. So that's when it becomes visible. It's a disease that manifests itself in cravings and relapse. That's the stuff that you can see. Both are primary illnesses. So I'll keep this short. A primary illness is generally one that if a person has it, nothing much will get better in their life until that's dealt with. Addiction, a person could try to be a better employee or a better partner or a better parent or more creative, better at pretty much anything in their life. But if there's an addiction going on, they're going to have a real hard time doing that. So that's just a general sort of approach is what are we going to tackle? Let's tackle the addiction first. There's problems at work, we'll get to those. There's problems in relationships, we'll get to those. The first thing needs to be tackled is addiction. So kind of in order, because if I want to, maybe as if you're somebody working on recovery or with people, folks try to fix their lives and keep addiction in it is a real tough, it's a real tall order to do that. So generally the addiction needs to be addressed. Progressive, so COVID-19 and addiction are both progressive illnesses in that they sort of build upon themselves. With addiction, you build tolerance. So with that is, start off at with a certain substance or a certain behavior, and that leaves a mark or leaves an impression on a person, and then the chase starts, and then it becomes more and more, and it becomes more often, and then tolerance builds and builds. And so maybe, as there's a certain amount that I would need to have to reach a certain level of intoxication, but I can never seem to reach it. So it progresses and progresses, and so the more that it progresses, the more it takes over my life, and the more things that I value get pushed out of my life, and my relationship with myself gets pushed out of my life. So yeah, with COVID-19, it's as people know, it's to be where it results in just Both can be fatal. So yeah, we know that. That's nothing new. What I always say about with that is addiction is more a spiritual fatality in terms of I lose my connection with myself, and I'm operating on impulse. I'm operating on immediate gratification. I'm not good to the folks I love, and they're having a hard time connecting to me, and that's a painful place to be. So restoring that in recovery is tough. So yeah, so when we lose ourselves to addiction, that's sort of a in itself. As we know, COVID-19 is that. So that's why we're being so careful. Both require rules of recovery to keep well. Excuse me. Not what we think is right. So the comparison there is the saying in recovery is I've tried getting clean a million ways other than the program says. So then, you know, I hand myself over to a recovery program, and I just do what I just do what it says, and then I learn about how to do recovery. Recovery is generally not. It's generally not doing what I think is right. A lot of times, that's what leads me back to addiction. So it takes a little bit of surrender. It takes willingness to do it. It takes forgiveness to do it. But overall, it takes dropping and letting go of pride to be able to get recovery going. It's asking for help, it's following some rules, and it's doing things maybe not your own way. It's you know, doing things the way that are suggested. That's the same as COVID-19. It's the same way we're getting out of this thing. Is we're all following rules. We're not doing what we want to do. We're doing what we're told to do, and that's going to save lives, and that's going to get us back to a normal society a lot faster. So yeah, this wraps up similarities. Tongue-in-cheek similarities. They're both on cruise ships. So you'll see people going on cruise ships wearing a bracelet, getting all they can drink, or maybe not. I'm just sort of having a little fun with it there. Yeah, so as you know, the early days it was COVID-19 was on the cruise ships. Both can give you fever and chills, and both can require a lot of toilet paper. So that's just a little tongue-in-cheek there, a comparison of COVID-19 and addiction. And there you see our good friend from Lord of the Rings there, just toilet paper instead of the ring. Okay, so moving forward, let's talk a little bit about differences. And as I mentioned before, about discrimination, this part of the presentation, we'll talk a little bit more about that. Having COVID-19 doesn't result in being stigmatized, stereotyped, and there's no power differentials. There's no unequal treatment unless you're somebody who doesn't have resources. But yeah, it's a situation where if you have COVID-19, you can ask for help immediately and you're not afraid, and that's an illness. With addiction, which is also an illness, you can feel as though you are other, and so the othering component is something that makes us feel like we're on the margins of society. We're not deserving. We're shameful, and so not worthy of the same treatment that somebody else may get. So that, you know, that othering can apply to lots of things, but that's created by society. That's not created by medical situation. Addiction and COVID-19 is also a medical situation. Because addiction is a social problem, there's an othering that occurs. So if you've ever felt that, if you're somebody who's in recovery and you felt that, you know what I mean. It's it's misunderstood, and so you sometimes don't ask for help when we need it because we're afraid of being blamed or labeled. And here a little bit, so I continue on with that here. This just speaks to the fact that we may not ask for help, and some of the reasons why we may not ask for help with addiction are fear of blame, judgment, losing relationships, losing our family, losing our friends, being labeled and talked about at work, and being further shamed and disappointing everyone. yeah, so you know, until we can get around some folks who aren't going to judge us and not going to label us, and and maybe have even gone through it themselves, it's going to be hard to let go of that sort of self-blame and self-loathing and fear of it, and start to like ourselves again, and get back to our value again. Yeah, because essentially, addiction is, I was used to say when I was working in rehab, that if there was a fuel you could pump into addiction, kind of like into a car, it would be shame. It's more or less the thing that keeps addiction going, is uh, a self-loathing, or a dislike of self, or a negative self-concept of some sort, keeps that going. So yeah, it puts us in a situation where we have shame, and then we go into society and we can experience more shame. And so that's where recovery programs become so important, is, in my opinion anyway, is to get with folks who have been there, know about that, done that, and you're just going to feel like you're talking to yourself, because they and you see Lucy there from, it was good. And psychiatric help, only 5 cents the price. And there you have good old Frank Gallagher, if you watch Shameless or not. But I have, and I love the show. But poor Frank. And I guess Frank makes fun of himself a lot, and it's probably just a lot of satire. But he, Frank is that guy. Frank's the guy that, he's unemployed. He is, criminal. He's and in that show. If you haven't seen the show, Frank Gallagher has an addiction, and he's shameless about it. He does not care. He just lives his life. They know him at the emergency room. The police know him. They know him in the jail system. They know him. All the first responders know him. And so, even though that Shameless is an entertaining show, and you can take, if you don't take it seriously that way, but it really does portray addiction to be that portrays addiction to be a negative thing. And somebody who doesn't have a good perspective on addiction might think that that's the way that what it really does to somebody. That's the way that it looks, which is a shame. So just wanted to get that out there, that way that we will see addiction is going to be through our own lens, and we'll understand it the way that we understand it. However, it's addiction's you and I, it's our loved ones, it's our friends, it's our family, it's anybody. It's the same as COVID-19. It's anyone can get this thing. Some other differences, I guess. The term harm reduction is a term that came into addiction treatment. It's been around for a long time, been around since the 60s. But it got to the east coast of Canada in the early 2000s in the form of methadone maintenance. And so what it is essentially is is where abstinence used to be the thing that was recommended to somebody. It's, well, I'm not ready to quit. I want to quit, but I'm not ready to today. So, there needs to be treatment. There needs to be a thought process that matches that. Like, we need to meet people where they are in their recoveries. We can't expect things of them that they're not ready to do. And so harm reduction is it's still not accepted everywhere. It's still slowly working its way into our treatment programs, and into all of our institutions and systems. It's comparable to COVID-19 in that you could say that what we're doing right now is harm reduction with COVID-19. We're staying home, we're using disinfectant, we're social distancing, and there's all these precautions that we're doing. And that's okay. But when it comes to addiction, a lot of times people will say, well, just stop using. There's no other option. There's no meeting the person where they are. So harm reduction is giving people the opportunity to learn about themselves, learn about recovery, learn about their addiction, learn about how they think and feel, and then understand all the things that are weighing down on them in society. Maybe there's somebody who was traumatized, as a kid, or abused, or orphaned, or there's all kinds of things going on behind the scenes with a person, with addiction than meets the eye, and it's not really about the substance. The substance is the solution. It's not the problem. So with that, I guess I just wanted to say that they're similar in that we're doing harm reduction for COVID-19, but it's different in that harm reduction is still a battle. A lot of times harm reduction depends upon who you have working in an organization and whether or not that person adheres or is passionate about harm reduction. And I want to give a shout out to Holly out at Black River and all the crew and residents out there. You guys are doing an awesome job. I've had the pleasure and privilege of working with you folks, and you guys are a gem. You're a ray of sunshine in an otherwise cloudy day. And the next one is addiction. Yeah, so addiction was a pandemic long before COVID-19 got here, and it's going to be long afterwards. Then that's the reality. Maybe as you know, it gets a blind eye turned toward it. It's pushed to the margins of society. People are afraid to ask for help. It's not something that's still in society where we are. It's still not accepted. It's still not. There's not enough treatment and resources for it. And that's and so I had said earlier about COVID-19 is a medical problem and addiction's a social problem. Social programs don't get the same funding in Canada or anywhere that medical programs do, of course. So it's not as prioritized in budgets. It's not as prioritized in agendas by those with power and money to address it. A lot of times, addiction is left to nonprofits and NGOs and non-government organization to deal with that. And those a lot of times those programs have no funding from the government. So that being said, to that point is there were 14,700 opioid-related deaths between 16 and 19. And worldwide last year, or sorry, in 2017, 585,000 people died of drug use. And we don't hear about that, right? We don't, it's not, that's behind the scenes. And that's left to a lot of organizations to deal with that don't have consistent funding. So I'm here to say today that that addiction is something that requires the resources. It requires the money, and it's going to continue on if that stigma and stereotype still exist. And it needs to be addressed just as seriously as COVID-19 is. So getting close to the end here. So yeah, I don't have anything that, like, as a counselor and as a clinician and as somebody, I'm not saying what to do. I don't ever say what to do. The answers are all inside of us. We are going to find a way to get well, and we're going to do it our way. But I just thought it was funny. I saw something on Twitter or Facebook the other day with the triangle there, the Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Somebody had drawn an arrow and pointed to the bottom part and said, "You are here." And so what that means is a lot of the upper parts of the triangle, which are belongingness and love, esteem, and self-actualization, is we're not going to be able to accomplish those now. The best we could do now is survive. And at the bottom, toilet paper, yeah, that's the ultimate survival. So it's right now is, again, is if we can let go of a lot of complex things right now and expectations of ourselves, that would be good. Let's just focus on what we can control and get through this. Excuse me. So some of the things that I found important, and I've said before, working with folks in recovery, is let's get the physical going first. Let's get ourselves physically a little bit well now. There will be lots of things later to talk about with trauma, with anxiety, with depression, with mental health, with families, with relationships, there'll be spiritual things. There'll be things to talk about down the road in counseling or with sponsors or with groups and things. But for now, let's just stick to what we can control. And a lot of times that's just around the house and how we live. So we do. So, and there's a saying that says, act like you're in recovery. So it's doing things every day that look like recovery, even though we don't maybe feel like it, we're still compelled and tempted and obsessed and preoccupied and have cravings. it's very difficult. Is we just get a routine going, and we get doing things in recovery, and hopefully the mind follows along. So one of the things that and these are things that I've done myself, and so I don't recommend anything I haven't done myself. I have gotten on a schedule. I have a bedtime, and I wake up, and I notice that if I don't stick to that, it doesn't feel great. So that's one thing you can do, and the only tool you need for that is a clock. So and I would always say to folks working in recovery, early recovery, is use the first tool as a clock. Get yourself on a good wake sleep schedule. Hydrate with water, not caffeine. Working with folks now who are into some decaffeinated teas and peppermint teas and some things like that, because all this downtime, and I don't have cigarettes there, but a lot of times in early recovery, it's coffee and cigarettes all day, and it's like, that's good. You're not using, staying safe, but that's not sustainable. That you're going to end up getting your nervous system too fired up, too out of whack with that. So to get the nervous system settled down and to get control of our thinking, it's good to just hydrate with water and watch the amount of caffeine. A lot of this stuff is very common sense, but one of the things that is recommended in recovery is personal hygiene. Always say to folks in recovery, in early recovery, make your bed, do your laundry, fold your clothes, brush your teeth. Like, they might sound like very simple things, but they're very, very important things. And people in recovery have referred to brushing their teeth as a spiritual thing, because if you looked at what it was like in addiction, how much time could go by? Putting on something other than pajama pants. And that's a joke now. It's like, I actually put jeans on today, so there's some similarities between COVID-19 and the way that it looked at addiction. Myself, I usually shave, and I just would go, days and weeks and not eating properly. And that's next, eating properly. So I always, whatever you're doing now is great. I'm not saying to do any of this stuff, but just saying that real food spoils. So it's like, if you can get something real in your diet at some point, and that's good. But real food, I know real food's expensive. So it's like, we do the best we can. There's no judgment there. If you're getting something into your system, that's better than nothing. And so get outside, as you know, that's a pretty common sense one. The vitamin D is going now with the sun. Anybody out there who has a seasonal affective disorder, or has depression, or has anxiety, or is struggling right now, is your medicine is in the sky. It's the sun. It's going to make you feel better. So try to get out again. I hate to say it, but exercise is, and as you know, if you're in recovery and you've learned about this stuff, or if you work with clients, you know that we have it inside anyway. It's called endorphins. One of the things we want to do in recovery is give ourselves a chance to resynthesize all those great hormones and neurotransmitters, and get that going on its own, so that we don't have to put substances in going anymore. It's just, our bodies and minds will do that on our own, and exercise will promote that. I've seen presentations on mindfulness, and they're excellent, and that's a great concept. And with mindfulness, I always say it's get in the moment however you can, whatever way, whatever method you have. In recovery, there's a saying, you can't drive a car looking in the rearview mirror. Getting through this time period is the same way. A lot of times, because we're bored and alone and left to our own thoughts, we can get ruminating about things that we've been through and had happen in our lives, and then all of a sudden that becomes a negative, just a cascading waterfall of negative thoughts. That leads to feelings, that leads to a preoccupation, which can lead to an obsession, which leads to compulsion. So getting in the moment is a meditation, it's a breathing, it's a music, it's resting, it's whatever it takes for you to get sort of out of the future and past. And I have hearing another human voice. I know that whole days have gone by for me where it might have just been Facebook videos, or YouTube videos or memes or stuff like that. I've forgotten to talk to people. And so I know that how critical that is, and just to get that contact, that's where the energy comes from in recovery. Generally, is another human being, and so even if it's a phone call or if it's maybe seeing a person's face on a great CMHA webinar, then then you'll maybe feel a bit better, a better looking face. So you can also sharing how you feel with another human being is important. As you know, the truth in how you feel. So that has to be somebody you trust. It's always say to folks working on recovery or clients or people in programs that it's hard to trust. People come out of addiction, generally end up in addiction with broken trust, and then come out of it with broken trust, and because they've been betrayed and been neglected and been abandoned. A lot of times folks have been really hurt by people in their lives and don't trust for good reason. It's not, they've been mistreated. So so finding someone you can trust is a tough thing to do. So when it happens and you have that feeling that you can say what the truth is to do that, whatever way you can. They call it in the program being rigorously honest. It's what it does is it has the ability to short circuit the progression of craving or the progression of addictive thinking and help us get back on track with ourselves. And the last one is to stay in control of what you can control. And what I've found is, and I've experienced this myself, is I've stopped watching the news so much. A lot of people have different reactions to COVID-19. People have a lot of different anxious and fearful reactions to it. And that's, when it comes to recovery, I guess what we try to develop is boundaries. And so boundaries are things that we use to keep ourselves safe. And boundaries are okay in recovery. Recovery is the most important thing in our lives. And without it, we're going to end up losing everything. So we want to maintain recovery. So that means we have to have boundaries. And having a boundary is keeping yourself safe from things like negativity, things like fear and panic. And I'm not saying to be insensitive. We're there for our family members and each other, but you can't light yourself on fire to keep somebody else warm. You are not expected to get anyone else well. You're not expected to get to remove somebody else's anxiety. That's their job. So yeah. So I guess just to keep in mind that as long as your side of the street's clean in recovery, that's all you're in control of right now today. And again, it's just for today. It's literally I just try to get to bedtime, and if I have to get 5 more minutes, I get there. So it's very short chunks of time, things that are in our control, and so that'll get us to tomorrow. And then there's another day, right? Yeah, so that's the end of the presentation. That's not my cat, but I have a dog that's behaving like that lately, just hanging out. So I'm going to end this now, and then I'm going to do questions and answers. Okay, question says, how can I support my clients struggling with opiate addiction without opiate replacement therapy? My program for new clients, my program for new starts is on hold due to COVID resource issues. I get you. When I was working in the methadone program here in St. John, folks would come in and we only had so many spots because we were the only methadone clinic in St. John, and so we had a wait list. And I had this conversation all the time with folks. Basically, it's you're going to harm reduction on this one. If folks are on medications, it's take your medication as prescribed. If folks are taking over-the-counter medications, it's be wary of the amount they're taking. If folks are taking opiates, try to take them as prescribed. And I know it sounds unrealistic, but really without any kind of opiate replacement therapy, what it comes down to is trying to develop some very basic skills that will serve the person well in recovery, when they can get opiate replacement therapy. So that being said, there's lots of things a person can learn about recovery while they're still using, or while they're in a position of not being able to have access to the resources. And those could be things like triggers, cravings, relapse, things to do with the lifestyles. There's some things about forgiveness, surrender. There's things about acceptance. There's things about acceptance versus admitting. There's things about talking a little bit about how they got where they're at, talking about what their reasons are for wanting to stop. Yeah, so I mean, that's just a few things. Again, like I'm a firm believer in opiate replacement therapy, and so I know that that's an important thing. Methadone and Suboxone and those types of drugs are at the end of the day, they're medicines as well. So they could be the thing that makes a person well, or maybe they combine that with recovery. So with recovery lifestyles and thinking and what they have access to. So I guess you can start working on some of that stuff. Oh, yeah. Sorry, I don't know if I had it on for the answer for. I had a question about opiate replacement therapy, and if you didn't see that, the answer to that was to teach the person about recovery, get the person as familiar as they can with recovery. Once they get started on methadone or Suboxone, then they'll have the weapons in their arsenal for recovery, and that pretty much sums it up. So we got one more. How can we recognize PAW? How long is it? How long? So post-acute withdrawal is something that it comes and goes depending on how we live. So what I mean by that is again, like, and similar to right now, is we develop some lifestyles in recovery. We start talking to people, sharing our feelings, writing some things down, doing some readings, getting some exercise, getting our sense of humor back, like doing some things like that. The thing about post-acute withdrawal is if I stop doing those things, if I let my recovery program go and I start going back to doing things that I just want to do, or things that feel good, it's funny that how post-acute withdrawal can return. So the good news is that it doesn't last forever, but it certainly depends on what we are doing in recovery, whether or not it flares up or not. And so post-acute withdrawal and relapse are very similar in that it's mental symptoms, addictive thinking, problems with emotional problems, mood problems, physical problems, and so I don't know if that answers your question, but it's some good news and some bad news. The good news is that once you're through your acute withdrawal, post-acute withdrawal is there, and you can get through that and you can feel good naturally. But if once we stop being accountable and let our recovery programs go, we're gonna know it. It's like folks with addiction have bad days and have good days and bad days, just like any other chronic illness. But it really, really depends in large part on what you're doing in your recovery about post-acute withdrawal. Okay, so I have another one now. What are the most important steps? What are the most important steps for clinicians to take to facilitate recovery for clients struggling with addictions during COVID-19? Step number one is acknowledge them for reaching out. I've had a few people reach out to me, and the first thing I do is commend them and validate that, and really, really provide a lot of positive encouragement for that. That takes a lot for somebody to appear on a doorstep or make a phone call is huge. So that's the one thing I would do. Two is ask them what they have for support outside of whatever it is you're going to be doing with them clinically. It's not going to practice that matters. It's what you do between practices. So and this is just my thinking on this, is you want to put the ball back in a person's court for what they can do to actually start taking action and work on their recovery in real time between counseling sessions in their own life, as it is in their circumstances and their environment. So what do they have for support? Some things that I mentioned earlier could be helpful too, like talk about routine and scheduling, like meeting them where they are. Maybe they already have that stuff going on, and you can zero in on what it is that's triggering them and what's causing them to have some struggling with addictive thinking or even using. Yeah, I heard that people can go to detox. So even though I think rehab programs are closed now, people can still go to detox, and I've had a few clients of my own that have taken that route, and so that's there too. As a clinician, I've had situations where I'm finding that folks are maybe getting going with using and going down that road further than they say. So I'm very thorough with my assessments for safety, just in terms of really talking about suicidal thinking and risk to them and risk to others. And so I guess that if that's part of it, I have taken a lot of time to go over those things. Yeah, I mean, there's common sense things like having a alcohol-free environment, having a drug-free environment. You know, it's a lot of free time, and it's a lot of money that people have. Like a lot of folks are, because restaurants and outlets and things are, a lot of different things are closed. People maybe have extra money. There's extra money coming in from the CERB money. There's extra GST money coming in. And I'm not saying that. I guess what I'm saying is lack of places to spend money, built up with boredom, is going to create like a influx of money. Is what to do with that is a lot of times people will hand that over to other people. Get somebody else to help them with that, so that they're not having to handle a lot of cash, or access to money, which could be a huge trigger. But yeah, I think that's pretty much for that. That's it for that one. I got another one now. Do you think detoxification admissions should be longer and mimic a rehab-like platform? Yes. I guess the way that I can answer that question is to say that before I worked in rehab, I had a concept of rehab of being that rehab was treatment, and that rehab was maybe even the end of something. But after learning about addiction and recovery, even rehab is the beginning of something, and rehab itself is not even really treatment. Rehab is a time period that a person has to be able to decide if they would like to live a recovering lifestyle or not. And so rehab gives a person the opportunity to learn about things, about themselves and the ways of recovery, and whether or not they can live that way in their own life. Detox, in my opinion, is, the length of time that it would take to properly detoxify a person before they got into a rehab is much, much longer than is available. And referring back to the earlier part of my program, is the resources just aren't there. There's not enough beds. There's protocols for withdrawal from certain substances that are perhaps written into a medical manual, and I'm not a medical staff, but the way that a medical protocol is written out doesn't take into account social factors, and/or other psychological issues, or cognitive functioning, or lots of things like that. So the biopsychosocial assessment that's done should result in a person spending more time in the detoxification phase, and then going straight from that into a rehab. And then the rehab program needs to be longer than they are now too, which I find across Canada is happening. Rehab programs now are up to maybe 90 days, even longer, which is a proper thing. In my opinion, recovery's a very, very slow, gradual process that's one layer built upon another. And you know, it's even though somebody's got years in, they're still going to have to work on it every day. But the first bit of it is really hitting it hard up front with, you know, doing a lot of learning, getting a lot of routines in place and a lot of practice. And so yes, I guess I can say I think they should be longer. As far as mimicking a rehab-like platform, people need to be well enough to engage in a rehab. They can't be like sick, acutely ill, or they're not going to be able to learn. So I think it's important that a person is through the acute withdrawal phase and has a chance to get settled so that they can sit through day rehabs or long days. And there's expectations in rehab too. So making sure a person's physically and mentally well enough to engage in that as at their pace, not anybody else's. Excellent webinar. Thank you. So yeah, thank you very much, everybody. I don't know if I did these questions and answers correctly, but anyway, for what it's worth, I've really enjoyed it. Again, my name is Paul Nason. If you have questions, call the CMHA, and thanks, Holly, and I'm available to take questions personally too. But it'll go through the CMHA. So, with that, all the best. Cheers, and love goes out to all you guys, and keep fighting the good fight.